Boards make decisions with the best intentions, but the ripple effects often turn out to matter more than the decision itself. Nina Henderson, a director of International Workplace Group, has spent her board career examining how compliance pressures and external scrutiny can push boards towards decisions that look like progress but quietly erode strategic thinking and agility. She joins us to unpack the unintended consequences boards most often fail to anticipate, how to tell real governance improvement from reactive box checking, and the habits that help directors spot second and third order effects before a decision is locked in. Nina, when you look at major board decisions that later created issues, what types of unintended consequences were not commonly anticipated?
Bill, I think everybody that's been in a decision-making mode for anything, whether they're on board or anything else, has tried to prepare themselves effectively for that decision-making. And I must say, I've been in a lot of industries, as you know, and I must say that most of the preparation for decision and the thinking in advance is pretty intense and well thought out to the best of one's ability, because none of us are soothsayers, as it were. But of course, there are realities that then, after you've made the decision and you start proceeding and executing, it's like, wow, what happened here? Why did this occur? And I do think one of the things that has occurred to me and that I've experienced is oftentimes the internal assessment of what would happen for a decision is very in-depth. There's all sorts of elements about why this makes sense, how it fits the strategy, or how it fits the expertise of the organization. All of those elements are included in the decision matrix, shall we say. But often the external things are in there, but they're not in there with what if. And I think one of the big issues about the external environment is that you can never, and your competition, your regulatory framework, the things that you really will have absolutely no control of, let's say geopolitical things of that nature. But the what if thing is very important. And building into the decision endpoint, one should always have the flexibility. So to me, it's always good to go through the why, when, and how. Yeah. But then what if X, Y, Z could happen? What will we do? What's the flexibility here? Can we retrench on something? Can we roll back? At what point is there a go, no go? All of these elements, I think, have to be put into the matrix ahead of time so you know what you're doing. The other thing is, I like to sort of check the pulse through something. Once you move into execution role, I'm calling it execution, but once you put it into the marketplace, or once you actually start making the capital investment and so on, are you looking at it routinely to see how it goes? Did you build in, guideposts of how things were supposed to transpire? And if something happened, can you turn left, right, or can you slow it down? Can you move it up? These are the things I think are so important in preparing oneself to take an enterprise forward, and most importantly, to take the talent forward. Because if you don't give yourself a big enough bandwidth to make responsive adjustments, you're in trouble. The other thing is, I think once you have, let's say you're well into an execution of something, what about your after action reviews? What happened? Did it go the way we thought? What did we miss? Well, if we didn't miss, was the budget over? All sorts of elements. And that goes way back to when you first start designing what you want to do and why, what it's going to cost you. What are the demarcations of success or failure? How much flexibility have I put in?
Have boards become too compliance oriented in ways that unintentionally weaken strategic thinking, risk taking, or management agility?
That's a really interesting element. I mean, to me, the most important thing a board can do is to really establish the enterprise's longevity, sustainability, etc. And that goes through every decision you've made strategically, where you're going, and taking the temperature of whether or not the strategy still makes sense. To me, strategic intention, strategic pathways are living, breathing situations that have to respond to the things we were talking about before on what may happen internally, externally. So, you have all that in front of you on a day-to-day basis, year-to-year basis. And I do think that takes a lot of time. I don't think any board meeting should be without strategic discussion. You should always be going back to how things are going, even when you're working on the annual business plan. So specifically to your question, I do think that it's easy for a board to get lost in the day-to-day, assuring that things are being done in line with compliance factors, regulatory factors, etc. Whether or not you're in a highly regulated industry or not, you still have a lot of compliance you should be looking at. And so I do think you can allow yourself to get trapped in all of that without going back to the essence of what your enterprise does well, doesn't do well, where you're going, how well you're pacing yourself, etc. And so I do think you have to guard against that. I also think sometimes you can get into a situation where you're looking too close to the mirror. You're not really looking beyond the horizon as to what may be happening. So you deal with the near in need to make sure that you've, dare we say, checked the box type of thing. And that never becomes beneficial. It takes away a lot of time. I'm not saying you don't pay attention to your rudder of how you conduct your business and your compliance elements. You do. But I would say I would link it more to enterprise risk and strategic intention to make sure that I do it as a parallel track.
How can directors distinguish between decisions that genuinely improve governance and decisions that simply respond to external pressure but may create long-term strategic consequences?
Now, I think that's a little bit of observing one's navel. If you're too much focused on your business and your capabilities and your near-term needs, and not constantly checking how that affects, strategically where you want to go, or some of the strategic decisions you've already made, or some that are still to come. If you're not, wrapping that in to your operating reviews, I think you're going to be at a disadvantage, because you're going to miss things. You're going to miss the forest for the trees. You're going to be very good at the trees, but you are going to miss the opportunity in the market, the danger in the market, whether or not things are going according to plan. I think it's very important to build in flexibility across the board. I really do. And that doesn't mean you're constantly changing things. It's just that you're giving yourself a measured understanding of, if you do X, what happens if Y happens?
What practices, questions, or boardroom habits help directors identify second and third order consequences before major decisions are made?
Well, the biggest one is look outside. I think we all tend to be a little bit myopic, and we think we understand our business and we think we understand our industry really well. But things are continuously happening, and you don't know what's going on in other boardrooms, like within your own industry and within surrounding and adjacent industries. And I think it is really important to be looking outside as much as you can. So it's important in the boardroom to bring the outside in. Now, yeah, you can do this with having your bankers come in and talk to you. You can put yourself in other people's shoes and examine your competitors and see what you think they're doing by their actions and so on. All these are really good. But I would also go a little bit further. I would go a little bit outside. For example, if you're in healthcare now and you are an insurer, let's say, for healthcare products, and if you were thinking about how you would cover the expense of medical care, let's say in cancer. Now, as we know, historically, you used to get I'm going to make this very simple because this is not true. And I don't mean to make cancer into a simplistic, if you have cancer, then you do this. So let me just excuse myself from that. But let's say that you would get like 6 weeks of chemotherapy and then you would move on, and that would be that. And you might go on some kind of maintenance, low level chemo or something of that nature. And so if you were an insurance company, you could figure out the cost of that. You could use through actuarial assumptions how long someone would have that kind of cancer, things that could happen to them in terms of cure rate or sadly not cure rates. Nowadays, the way you do cancer treatments is specific to you and me. You'll get one cocktail, I'll get another cocktail, and we'll be taking that for a long time. So this changes the basic kinetics of how you price out, what your premium would be, what the scope of your coverage would be, etc. And I think, I realize I'm making it very simplistic, but there's a major change that is a health protocol that one has to take into thought. Then let's say your structure, I'll stick with healthcare, changes in terms of how you receive the care. Is it in an institution like a hospital? Is it delivered at home? All these things change the cost of it, change the premium, change the duration. We could go into a lot of other industries and do the same kind of thing. I think it's important, again, to sort of say, how could change happen to us? You're never going to get it exactly right. If you do know somebody, Bill, who gets that right, I think we ought to get them and go into business with them, But I think that these are things that are important. So I would bring into the boardroom outside experts, adjacent areas, the concentric elements that surround my industry, try to make sure that I had a broader view of what was going on and recognize that changes all the time.
Executive compensation is a classic example of incentives shaping behavior. What are some examples where compensation structures or performance metrics unintentionally push management towards behaviors the board never actually intended?
Well, first and foremost, any kind of compensation plan, design should be linked to your strategy. If you're isolating compensation just in relationship to how your competition pays in your similar industry, you're going to make a mistake right up front. So first you have to figure out your strategic interest, what you're trying to achieve from that, what's the time horizon across that implementation. And then you put together the design of how you will compensate, how you will set up the performance metrics, because all those things have to be related to the specific strategic intention, how long it takes to get it done, what can happen, and what measures, what yardsticks you're going to use to see if it's going well. So to me, that's where you start. That's the essential part. You do look at competitive environment, yes, of course, because you want to make sure that you don't lose talent because you're out of sync with competitive pay. But it has to go back to what you're trying to do. And a lot of times, if your metrics are just broad-based metrics without having it tied to what you're trying to accomplish, you can get off the track pretty easily. Now, having said that, I also think you don't want numerous metrics. You want, very clear-cut metrics that you and your management agree to as really indicators of whether or not they would be delivering. So you want to do that. And also, I think you want to make sure while you're dealing with CEO compensation, of course, you're also dealing with the people that report to them and then your whole talent bank. So at a board level, you should know how your management is paying the team below, because if there's something in there, even though the leader might be great describing what they want to do, have great ways to check on whether things are going well, motivating. But if your compensation structure leads people in another route, already it breaks down. So I do think it's really important to see whether or not there is a reasonableness about what the compensation is trying to reward and how you're measuring whether the reward meets with your strategic intention and the delivery of that. It should all be about delivery, all about strategy. So I think that's really crucial. I mean, one of the most comical things that I experienced years ago. And this most people would catch this. But let's say you're dealing with unions and you've negotiated a 3 or 4 year contract for the way in which people are paid. And let's say in the document you didn't clarify whether you were paying on gross revenue or net revenue, for example. If you take a price increase and it's on gross revenue, everybody is getting an increase in their salary based on that. And that may have nothing to do with what you wanted them to focus on. The most comical, well, sad aspects of that is if you have a a unionized group which is paid like something like that, that hopefully one would catch, and then you have management which is not paid on that kind of a situation. You end up having your union people paid more than your account managers for your sales group, for example. So all crazy things can happen. As that one's a real easy one for most people to sort of raise their eyebrows and say, "Oh, we'd never do that." But boy, it's always important to look at those old contracts. That's another thing. Check the history of what you've been doing, because things do tend to, shall we say, stay unchallenged. You need to challenge things. You need to say, the other thing I think is interesting, even if like in your CDNA in the US and you've disclosed, of course, your design, you've disclosed each year how you've implemented your design, and you've done it for your CEO and your top managers. It's all out there. And you've gotten, let's say, from the proxy advisors and your investors, you've gotten a high percentage of approval for it. I wouldn't rest on my laurels. I'd go back in and check to make sure that design is fit for purpose, because things change. I'm not saying you should automatically change. If something is working, don't change it, but do a fit for purpose analysis to make sure it still parallels what's happening in your business, your industry, and how your people are performing.
How can board decisions around CEO succession, crisis response, or maybe even restructuring unintentionally reshape corporate culture in ways directors may not immediately recognize?
Well, I think that goes to, it's all about the people. I mean, when you do set up a business strategy, or you're trying to execute an annual business plan, which is part of your longer range strategy, are you really sure that you have the right talent in the spots? Do they have the capabilities? Have you helped them to use their capabilities to make something happen and to deliver against what you're anticipating? And a lot of times we don't do enough of that. We don't really assess, if you pivot something in a strategy, or you pivot a business plan, or there's a major external thing that happens, or your competition beats you into the marketplace with something. Have you assessed whether or not you have the talent, and have you equipped them with the tools to make it happen? I just think often we think, oh, everybody can do that. Everybody will get together and we'll make it happen. It doesn't work like that, because sometimes you may have great talent, but you may have to switch them around. Some people may no longer, their talent may no longer fit what you want, but they might fit into another area of the company. I'm not saying you necessarily jettison those people, but you might want to reshape who's doing what and how they're doing it. So I think that would be one thing that's really important. I also think that if you've made a mistake, i.e., you've put somebody in the wrong position, or the crisis crept up on you and so on, be the first ones to say, this is what happened and this is what we think we can do about it. Be the first ones to pull the plug. And as a board, be supportive of that kind of behavior. You don't want everybody waiting until the situation is really detrimental to the enterprise. If something is going awry, as the leader, as the CEO, or encourage your management to be able to come to the CEO, and then the CEO to come to the board, and let everybody know as soon as you know. I think that's really a really important thing. Often it's sort of like we do it in our own lives. It's like, well, it'll be okay. Not usually, it doesn't, you kind of have to say, okay, all right. We have an issue here. Let's examine it. Let's see what we can do about it. The other thing is, I had a boss one time years ago who said to me, "Don't become an apple polisher." And I looked at him and I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, you can spend your life making the apple look really good and keep polishing." He said, "The important thing is to take a bite. And then if it's not good, throw it out or cut that section out." So I just thought it stuck with me because it was such a wonderful analogy about not dallying. If something isn't exactly making sense to you and your leadership and the full board, don't pull the plug, but get on it quicker.